You are looking at an absolutely jaw-dropping moment in Canadian politics, in Alberta politics. That is Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney, who has just resigned as leader of the United Conservative Party. He faced a leadership review. We've been anticipating the results of that review. You can see him shaking hands with some supporters in that room just outside of Calgary. The results came in, 34,298 votes. 51.4% in favor of Kenney staying on as leader, 48.6% against him staying on. The Premier took to the stage, and despite saying he considered a majority of the votes, 50% plus one in the past, enough to stay on, he acknowledged that that was not an endorsement, 51.4%, not an endorsement of his leadership, and he would resign as leader of the party. He asked the party's board, he said, to come up with a leadership an election date for an election process for the person who would replace him. He also talked about unity quite a bit, struck a message of it's time to clear the air, I think was the phrase he used, and move on. You can see him there continuing, want to keep on that live shot in the room there, him shaking hands with supporters. Like I said, though, really a jaw-dropping moment. Certainly the Premier had not telegraphed at all in the lead up to this outcome, to this announcement, that he would be giving up with any kind of majority, that he would be resigning, or acknowledge that there was too much dissent within the party, a lack of support for him. Those were not the words that I think most Albertans expected to hear tonight, but certainly about half of his party who voted, more than 34,000 of them in this leadership review. This was the outcome that they wanted. I want to bring in two people who have been listening with me throughout this leadership review and listen to that speech from the Premier. Don Braid is a longtime columnist at the Calgary Herald. Janet Brown is a longtime pollster. Both of them were on with us right before this. I have to ask, look, Don, I'm going to start with you. I listened to those first words out of the Premier's mouth and my jaw did drop. That was not what I expected. The 51% was also a very low number, but I'm not sure I thought he would resign that quickly. Your reaction?
It's quite stunning when you consider what this fellow did, putting two warring parties together, leading them to a gigantic majority in the House, still with a majority of more than 30 seats in the legislature, with the economy recovering. And he's pushed to the brink and quits through some of his own follies and through the nature of his party. And frankly, I'm stunned. There is no outcome tonight that would have surprised me. This doesn't really surprise me. But I can't say that I totally expected it either. And, you know, the next question, I think he had to do this because the division was just going to go on and on and on. It would just be the Rachel Notley's dream in the opposition. There was going to be more division. And now we look at who's next, because there's really nobody's name is out there as a real candidate. We know people have been jockeying within caucus and everything, but the next few months are going to be just as interesting as this.
Yeah, Janet, I think, Don hits the nail on the head. Like, it shouldn't surprise us necessarily, because we knew it was a possibility, right? We knew that even maybe the Premier wouldn't get 50% of the vote ahead of him, but it was still stunning to hear it. I mean, it was an acknowledgement, a very clear acknowledgement that that Jason Kenney did not feel he had the support of the party, that the results bore that out, and that the best thing for the party, he seemed to indicate, would be for him to leave.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking it was too close to call, and 51-49 is too close to call. It's the very definition of that. So I think 51% for the Premier was always within the realm of the possible. But, I can't say that I expected the Premier to leave if he got a number that low. The Premier has been saying quite clearly that 50 plus one was enough to stay on. I think it's the right decision to leave. This is too close a vote. This is his base. It's not the general public. This is absolutely the right choice. But it didn't look like Jason Kenney was going to make this choice. It looked like he was going to hang on come hell or high water. But I guess even this was too disappointing a number even for Jason Kenney, given how low he set expectations going into this race.
Don, you mentioned like the what now question doesn't seem to have a very specific answer. It sounded like from the Premier's speech, the party now gets together, figures out what a leadership election looks like when it takes place. What happens in the interim to the process of governing?
Well, tomorrow, caucus is meeting from 11 to 1 at McDougall Centre in Calgary, and they almost certainly will pick a new premier. This happened in 2014, Bessie, when Dave Hancock, you remember, replaced Alison Redford when she resigned.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been talk. In fact, a bunch of names came up, and I've mentioned a few of them today, of people who are jockeying to be interim premier. Because an interim premier is actually the real thing. They got the full powers on all the privileges and the salary and everything. So a lot of people in caucus would like to have that job. But what happens next? There's something really interesting going on here. Like, which way does this party tilt? Jason Kenney, who has such a reputation as a ferocious conservative, was actually quite moderate in some areas with federal-provincial relations. There's certain things he got done with Ottawa. On certain social issues, he had his beliefs, but he never really did anything. The big question for a lot of people is going to be, does this party go a little more toward the middle to try and hit off the NDP, or does it get taken by one of the much more conservative people in Jason Kenney's caucus?
Janet, let's take a moment for people, and I keep saying this, but who might not be, intimately familiar with Alberta politics, to take a step back and think to when Jason Kenney went back to the province, left federal politics, successful run to be the leader of the PC, then the UCP party, and then a resounding victory in the election. I remember being there then, and it is, you have to stop for a second and say, wow, from that to this is, quite a trajectory.
Well, I mean, the casual observer of Alberta politics, I mean, just you can't believe how crazy things are in this province. I've lived here for 22 years. Vashi, you spent your time here. Dawn's been covering politics even longer than the two of us. And every day is a surprise in Alberta politics. So I'm just so sick in the last couple of years of using the word unprecedented, but every day it seems we come up with another unprecedented scenario. Now, we do, as Dawn said, we do have a history of pushing premiers out, conservative premiers out while they're in power. No conservative premier has managed to run in 2 elections since the Ralph Klein days. But Jason Kenney was really flying so high. He ran against a very popular leader of the opposition, Rachel Notley, but managed this resounding victory. And to think that, 3 years later, he's leaving office, it's really mind-boggling.
What did you think of the message he delivered in his speech, Dawn? What did you think of the tone? Did you recognize the premier politically in that moment?
Very much so. He is very proud of his record. The economy started to recover. In fact, we may surprise a lot of Canada by doing better than we ever did, not just because of oil prices. And all that started to happen. And he always felt that once COVID was sort of past, once the major danger was gone, once the economy came back, oil prices jumped up, the budget is actually balanced in this province, that he really could just rocket past all the unpopularity, take back the old popularity. And yet it never quite happened. And some of the mistakes he made, that he's really in this with his own party. This wasn't about the general public. And the mistakes he made with his own party, some of the way he demonized some of the people on the fringes of his party, that offended people in the center of the party too. And I think he maybe the 2 or 3%, 5% more that he could have won here and could have kept his leadership, he may have lost for himself.
Janet, what are you watching for tomorrow, tonight, in the fallout from this?
Well, as Dawn said, there's a caucus meeting at 11 a.m. That caucus meeting has been scheduled for a few days because the caucus was going to need that meeting regardless of the outcome. They were because Kenney has now stepped down, the first order of business will be electing an interim premier, although as Dawn says, that's a term we use, but that person will be the full premier. But they will elect somebody within their ranks who agrees not to run in the permanent leadership race. Then the party will regroup and get a leadership race together. And we're almost exactly 1 year away from, the next scheduled election, according to our fixed date election legislation here in Alberta. The party will want to make that happen as soon as possible because, as I said, Rachel Notley is a very popular leader of the opposition. The left flank in this province is very much united behind her. So, it's not a case that like it is in Ontario where Doug Ford was sort of, elected at the last minute as leader of his party, but then went on to win the election. It's not going to be quite so easy to get to victory. So the UCP is going to be looking to act fast so that they can have a new premier in place and he can establish himself well ahead of the next scheduled election.
If you're just tuning in now, you're being greeted by some massive political news on the Canadian political landscape, and that is that the Premier of Alberta has resigned as leader of his party after facing a leadership review in which 34,298 party members cast a ballot. As you can see on the screen ahead of you, just over 51% of them expressed support for Jason Kenney's leadership. Just over 48% of them expressed their disapproval, though the Premier had conveyed in the lead up to this review that anything over 50+1, he considered a majority. He had said he would fight to remain the leader of the party. He, in fact, tonight recognized that that was not a number that constituted the level of support that would enable him to continue on in the position. He therefore said he would resign and that there would be, or he had asked the party board to direct a leadership election to replace him as leader. As my colleagues Don Braid and Janet Brown have been talking about tonight, there is a meeting being held tomorrow among members of his caucus during which we can expect perhaps the establishment of an interim leader among a whole host of other things. For people who I keep saying, who aren't necessarily familiar with the political landscape, Don, the leader of the NDP, Rachel Notley, who used to be the premier before Jason Kenney, has certainly been, Jason Kenney's fiercest critic. Her party has seen, polls and fundraising benefits to what's happened to Jason Kenney and with Jason Kenney and to the detriment of him. What do you think she's thinking tonight?
Well, I think she's thinking she just lost her best friend. It's no secret that the NDP thought Jason Kenney was an excellent opponent in the next election because of his very unpopularity. And there's always the possibility it happens. You mentioned Ford, the context is different, but that a new leader can suddenly jump to a victory. So that could happen. But, they've got a rough road to hoe. Rachel Notley at her leadership, at her convention recently, got 98.5% approval from her people. There is virtually no division on the left of this province. The province is completely polarized between left and right, and yet the right is totally shattered. There's no semblance of unity. There's also the Wild Rose Independence Party, which in some polls has shown up to 14%, and that all comes from the Conservatives. But I will say this. There's a very strong Conservative base in this province, and that base won't want to lose another election to Rachel Notley. So it could be surprising. It could be that the UCP comes up with a new leader, someone very different, maybe some urban female. There's a couple of very good people in the caucus, or somebody even from Edmonton, and they might, who knows, they could pull it off because the base is there. And the NDP is aware that they don't have the percentage natural base in this province. It'll be up to the next person to try and capture that.
I guess that's what we turn our attention now. Who next? I'm not sure I was thinking about that in the lead up to this, but now we do turn our attention there. I want to thank both of you, Don Braid and Janet Brown, for being here on this really, truly historic night. Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.